The last person to see Brett Morrison alive said he looked back once before disappearing into the darkness. In that brief glance, something in his eyes looked wrong. It was not fear. It was something quieter, something that felt like resignation. As if he already knew he would not be coming back. The corridor behind him was silent. The hum of the dorm's fluorescent lights faded as the door clicked shut. Outside, the air carried that October cold Alberta is known for. Not the sharp, punishing cold of winter, but the damp kind that seeps through denim and bone. Brett zipped his jacket and started walking. He had received the call minutes earlier. A male voice, calm but urgent, told him to come to the old grain elevator east of the access road. It was not a request. It sounded like part of something planned, something he had been waiting for. When the call ended, Brett sat for a moment staring at the phone, then quietly began tying his boots. He left his dorm room light on. His textbooks were open, a half-finished assignment on the desk. His roommate, Owen McLeod, was still at the library, unaware that this would be the last time the bed across from his would ever be slept in. Brett walked across the empty campus. The sound of his steps echoed on the pavement. The parking lot lights flickered in the distance, each one casting long shadows over the frosted ground. Somewhere far off, a dog barked once and stopped. The town of Drumheller was small, but the spaces between its buildings felt enormous at night. He turned down the service road that led to the old elevator. It had been abandoned for more than a decade, a tall, narrow structure of weathered wood that looked skeletal under the moonlight. Local students used to tell stories about it. Dares, secret meetings, the kind of rituals that universities pretend not to know about. Brett had heard the rumors, of course. Everyone had. A test of courage, a silent initiation, a night hike that was supposed to separate the serious students from the ones who would never make it through the forestry program. But this was not supposed to happen yet. The upperclassmen had said nothing official, and yet, here he was, walking alone into the dark, summoned by a voice that had refused to identify itself. His hands were in his jacket pockets. His breath came in short, pale clouds. He kept glancing behind him, as if expecting someone to follow, but the road stayed empty. Every few steps he hesitated, then forced himself to keep going. A mile out, the gravel road curved east. That was where the elevator stood, its faded red paint peeling away, its metal roof half collapsed from years of wind. The faint creak of rusted siding drifted through the air. Brett stopped, staring up at the black outline against the sky. For a moment, he thought about turning back. The phone call had been too strange, too sudden, but curiosity, or pride, held him there. He had always been quiet, observant, the kind who avoided trouble, but tonight felt different. He stepped closer. The wooden door at the base was slightly open, swinging gently with the breeze. Inside was complete darkness. He reached into his pocket for his small flashlight, the one he used for field work, but it would not turn on. The batteries had died. From somewhere inside came a sound, faint, metallic, almost like a chain shifting. Brett froze. He waited, listening. Nothing followed. The air smelled of dust, oil, and decay. He took one slow step forward, then another. The gravel crunched under his boots. He stopped again and looked back once, toward the dim lights of the university far behind him. That was when the witness, a student passing on a nearby trail, saw him for the last time. Brett hesitated at the doorway, framed in the glow of the moon. Then, without another sound, he stepped inside the grain elevator's shadow and disappeared. Before he became the name on missing posters, Brett Morrison was simply a quiet kid from Portland, Oregon. He grew up in a small house near Forest Park, where the air always smelled faintly of rain and cedar. He spent his childhood walking the trails behind his neighborhood, collecting pine cones, and sketching trees in a worn notebook he kept for years. He was the only child of Carol Morrison, a single mother who worked as a dental hygienist. Their relationship was close, built on routine and quiet understanding rather than words. Carol often said that her son had an old soul, someone who listened more than he spoke, who noticed things other people overlooked. Brett was not the kind of teenager who stood out in crowds. His teachers remembered him as reliable, curious, and polite. He was the student who volunteered to stay behind after lab sessions, cleaning beakers or labeling slides. He had no record of trouble, no sudden outbursts or reckless behavior. If anything, he seemed too careful, as if he was always waiting for permission to exist in the background. His passion for forestry started early. In high school, he joined an environmental science club, where he learned about ecosystems, soil health, and conservation work. The forests of the Pacific Northwest fascinated him, the way everything in nature depended on balance. That fascination eventually shaped his future. When college applications began, he focused on programs that offered fieldwork, not just lectures. The university in Drumheller, Alberta was small, affordable, and known for its hands-on forestry management course. It was far from home, but the idea of studying in another country excited him. Carol was hesitant. Canada felt distant, unfamiliar, but Brett was persistent. He told her it would be good for him, a chance to grow, to prove that he could build a life beyond Portland's gray skyline. When he received the acceptance letter, Carol tried to hide her worry behind a proud smile. She helped him shop for supplies, bought him a sturdy duffel bag, and wrote his name on the inside tag of every jacket. The night before he left, they ate takeout at their kitchen table. Brett promised to call every Sunday. Carol promised not to cry at the airport. Neither kept their promise. In Drumheller, Brett adjusted slowly. He sent emails about the prairie winds, the strange red rock formations, and how different the stars looked at night. He missed the rain. He missed home. But he told his mother that he was managing fine, that he had friends, that classes were good, and that everything was normal. On October 16, 2002, one day before he disappeared, Carol called him. She had a list of small questions about his classes, his meals, and whether he was sleeping enough. He sounded tired but steady. Before hanging up, she told him that she loved him. He said he loved her too. It was the last time she ever heard his voice. When Brett Morrison did not return to his dorm that night, no one noticed at first. It was midterm season, and students often stayed out late studying or drinking. His roommate, Owen McLeod, came back around midnight and found Brett's bed untouched, the desk light still on. The phone was off the hook. At first, Owen assumed Brett had gone out with classmates. By morning, unease began to settle in. By 9 a.m., Owen started asking around campus. No one had seen Brett since the evening before. The cafeteria staff confirmed he had missed breakfast. His professors marked him absent in class. When his mother's calls went unanswered that afternoon, Owen finally walked to the local RCMP detachment and filed a missing person report. Sergeant Dana Keller was the first officer assigned to the case. She had worked in Drumheller for nearly a decade and understood that small towns carried long memories. Most disappearances turned out to be misunderstandings. A runaway argument, a weekend trip, a night that went too far. She expected Brett would resurface within 24 hours. Officers began by searching the university grounds. They checked dorm rooms, utility sheds, and wooded areas nearby. Nothing. When Keller interviewed students, a few mentioned hearing about a gathering at the old grain elevator, a place they described as off-limits but popular. That was enough to shift the search east of campus. By late afternoon, a small team reached the site. The grain elevator stood exactly as the town remembered it, tall, hollow, and silent against the wind. Keller walked the perimeter with her flashlight, scanning for footprints or signs of disturbance. They found one clear boot print near the doorway, pressed deep into the dirt. The tread matched the hiking boots Brett's roommate said he owned. A few feet away, faint tire marks cut through the mud, as if a vehicle had turned sharply before driving off. The impressions were shallow, impossible to trace. No drag marks, no signs of struggle. Inside, dust coated every surface. The air smelled of rust and bird droppings. The floorboards creaked under every step. Keller noted a discarded beer can and a broken flashlight casing, but nothing that confirmed what had happened there. The team widened the search to nearby ditches and the riverbank. They used cadaver dogs and aerial scans, but the terrain was rough and the results inconclusive. By nightfall, the temperature had dropped below freezing. The search was suspended until morning. Back at the detachment, Keller reviewed Brett's belongings. His wallet, passport, and textbooks were still in his dorm. His email showed no unusual messages. There were no signs he planned to leave, but there was also no evidence of a crime. 2 days later, after failed ground searches and growing media attention, the RCMP issued a statement. At this stage, investigators have found no indication of foul play. The disappearance of Brett Morrison is being treated as a likely accident or voluntary departure. In Drumheller, that announcement settled over the town like frost. The silence that followed would last for years. In any disappearance, the first 3 days decide everything. In Drumheller, those 72 hours passed in quiet confusion. Detective Sergeant Dana Keller began her morning briefing at 7 a.m. on October 18, 2002. The whiteboard behind her already listed the essentials. Male, 18, missing since 10/17. Last seen near campus, possibly at Old Grain Elevator. The RCMP response was quick. Patrol cars were dispatched along the eastern access road, while ground teams began a systematic search toward the Red Deer River. The river cut through the town like a scar, narrow and cold, surrounded by steep banks and tall grass. Keller had investigated drownings before. It was not an impossible theory, but something about Brett's last movements did not fit. His roommate said he had been calm, not intoxicated, not distressed. The phone call that pulled him from his dorm remained unexplained. That first morning, officers knocked on dorm doors, collecting statements from students who had seen or heard anything unusual. The accounts blurred together. One student claimed Brett had been seen walking with a group near the library around 8:30 p.m. Another insisted he left alone. A cafeteria worker thought she saw him in the common area closer to 9:02. The timeline shifted with every interview. Keller wrote everything down, but trusted none of it. By noon, a local radio station aired the story. American student missing in Drumheller. The headline spread fast. Volunteers from campus joined the search, forming lines across open fields, calling Brett's name into the wind. Helicopters scanned the area with infrared equipment. Police divers examined the slow bends of the river where debris collected against the banks. Nothing surfaced. Late that afternoon, a new detail arrived, an anonymous call to the RCMP detachment. The voice was male, low and uneasy. The caller said only, "Check the elevator again." Then the line went dead. The number was traced to a prepaid phone that could not be located. Keller ordered a second sweep of the elevator site. Officers found the same single boot print, the same faint tire tracks. A forensic team took plaster casts, but the patterns were too common for analysis. Inside, the dust and debris remained undisturbed. No fingerprints, no blood. No sign that anyone had been there since the first search. That night, Keller drove to the Morrison dorm herself. She examined Brett's desk, papers neatly stacked, pen capped, computer off. His duffel bag sat open at the foot of the bed, half packed as if for a short trip. His jacket was gone. His phone records showed one outgoing call before 9 p.m., but the number was unlisted. She wrote in her notes, "Spontaneous meeting? Planned, unknown contact." The next morning, a media crew from Calgary arrived. Cameras filmed near the campus sign while reporters interviewed students in parking lots. Words like mystery and stranger disappearance began to appear on television crawls. Keller gave a short, cautious statement to the press. "We are pursuing all leads," she said, "and treating this as an active search and rescue operation." By the second evening, leads began to dry up. The anonymous call produced nothing further. None of the students admitted to organizing any event near the elevator. Some whispered about initiation night, but no one would go on record. The university urged students not to speculate. By the third day, the search grid had stretched 10 miles east of Drumheller. Officers walked shoulder to shoulder across barren fields while helicopters circled above. The only sound was the drone of rotors and the wind cutting through the grass. When Keller returned to her office that night, she turned on the television. The evening news played a brief update. No new information in the disappearance of American forestry student Brett Morrison. The anchor paused for a second before moving to the next story. By the third day, Brett Morrison's name had already begun to fade from the news ticker. Drumheller was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and where silence traveled faster than truth. The town sat pressed between rust-colored hills and open prairie, a place that felt both wide and claustrophobic. When Brett Morrison vanished, people did not rush to talk. They lowered their voices. In diners and hardware stores, the story spread in fragments. Some said the American boy had run off. Others whispered that he had been caught in something foolish. A dare gone wrong, a prank that turned serious. A few blamed outsiders, the city kids, who never understood how rural towns worked. By the end of the week, gossip had replaced evidence. Detective Sergeant Dana Keller continued her work quietly, but she could sense resistance. The university's administration cooperated in name only, cautious about its image. Students avoided interviews or repeated rehearsed lines. "I do not know anything. I was not there." The rumors of hazing floated just beneath the surface, never spoken aloud in front of officers. It was during this silence that Carol Morrison arrived from Oregon. She stepped off a small regional flight carrying only a suitcase and a folder of printouts, her son's schedule, his student ID photo, and a list of every number he had called from his dorm. She looked tired but composed, the way people look when they have not yet accepted the scale of what they have lost. At the RCMP station, Keller met her in a small conference room. Carol listened to the official summary in stillness, her hands clasped together on the table. When the detective finished, she asked one question. "You think he is alive?" Keller did not answer. Over the next few days, Carol moved through Drumheller with quiet determination. She printed flyers at the town's copy shop and taped them to utility poles, shop windows, and bus shelters. She stood outside the campus cafeteria handing them to students who avoided her eyes. She spoke with local journalists who promised to look into it, but moved on when new stories came. In the evenings, she sat in the motel lobby beside a stack of missing person posters, watching people walk past without stopping. The stillness of the town began to unsettle her. It was not grief that filled the air. It was avoidance. At the university, she met a few sympathetic students who remembered Brett from orientation. One of them, a quiet engineering major, told her that he had heard talk of a secret event held every October. A tradition, he called it. But before Carol could ask more, he stopped himself and changed the subject. That night she returned to the motel, frustrated and restless. When she reached her door, she noticed something slipped under it, a folded piece of notebook paper. The handwriting was rushed, the ink smeared. It said only 6 words. "Ask about initiation night, trust no one." Carol read the note twice. Then she sat down on the bed, realizing for the first time that Brett's disappearance might not have been an accident at all. By the second week, the search for Brett Morrison had shifted from urgency to unease. What began as a missing person case now lived in whispers, rumors of hazing, of a night that no one wanted to name. Students on campus spoke cautiously. They called it initiation night, an unofficial tradition, not recognized by the university but quietly tolerated. Each October, new forestry students were taken to off-campus sites, old barns, empty fields, the abandoned grain elevator. It was supposed to be harmless fun, but no one would say what really happened. The name that surfaced again and again was Travis Bauer. 21 years old, tall, confident, a senior in Brett's program. He was known for pushing limits, drinking challenges, dares, and games that blurred the line between thrill and danger. To his friends, Bauer was charismatic. To those who crossed him, he was unpredictable. Detective Sergeant Dana Keller brought Bauer in for questioning on October 25th. He sat with his arms crossed, leaning back in the chair, polite but detached. Keller asked him directly if there had been an initiation event the night Brett disappeared. Bauer denied it. He said he had been home watching a game with friends. 2 of them confirmed his alibi, word for word. When Keller pressed about Brett, Bauer shrugged. "Quiet guy," he said, kept to himself. Maybe he needed a break. Outside the interview room, Keller noted how the story felt rehearsed. Each friend gave the same times, the same details. Too clean. When the RCMP requested the forestry department's student event records, the university provided only partial documentation. The dean insisted that no official activities took place after hours. Off the record, one staff member told Keller, "You'll never find a list." Everything was passed by word of mouth. Back on campus, Carol Morrison continued her search alone. She sat in the student cafe, asking gentle questions, showing Brett's photo. Some students avoided her, others whispered apologies. One told her about a field notebook Brett always carried, pages filled with plant sketches and coordinates from his environmental studies project. It had been last seen on his dorm desk. When Keller checked the evidence inventory, the notebook was gone. 2 days later, a lab technician reported another missing item, the memory card from Brett's small digital camera, which had been logged but now could not be located. The report vanished quietly into paperwork. No follow-up was recorded. Keller grew frustrated. Leads disappeared as quickly as they emerged. The university discouraged further media coverage, saying it harmed the institution's reputation. When Keller pushed for a formal statement about hazing, her request was denied by regional supervisors who called the rumors unsubstantiated. The investigation slowed. Patrols were reduced. Reporters stopped visiting the site. To the public, it seemed as if the case had reached its natural end. But inside Keller's office, the walls were still covered in photos, maps, and notes that pointed to the same question. Why had Brett gone to the grain elevator that night? Carol refused to let the silence close around her. She joined online forums dedicated to missing persons, uploading Brett's picture and case details. Most users offered sympathy. A few hinted at darker theories. Late one night, Carol wrote her own post, a statement of disbelief, and a quiet accusation aimed at whoever was reading. Her words spread through small online circles, copied and reposted across discussion threads. My son did not just vanish. Someone knows. Someone is keeping quiet. It was not an official report, not a press release, but it carried more weight than any police statement. Because in Drumheller, where rumors died before reaching daylight, Carol Morrison's message was the first voice that refused to fade. By the spring of 2003, the posters had faded. The wind tore at the corners of Brett Morrison's missing person flyers until they hung in shreds along the fences and light poles. The investigation had stalled, and Drumheller slipped back into its quiet rhythm, the kind of silence that forgets. For Carol Morrison, forgetting was impossible. She returned to Oregon with her son's belongings packed into a single box, his sketchbook, a few textbooks, a denim jacket, and the key to a dorm room that no longer existed. She kept them in her living room, stacked neatly beside a framed photograph, Brett smiling beneath the tall pines near Mount Hood. Every October, she came back to Drumheller. She held small candlelight vigils by the Red Deer River, usually alone, sometimes joined by a handful of students who remembered the story. She would stand in the cold, her breath visible in the night air, repeating the same promise into the wind. I will not stop. In 2004, she built a website. Its design was simple, a black background, a single photo of Brett, and a timeline of his disappearance. She updated it with letters to him, appeals for information, and scanned copies of RCMP reports. The site drew small waves of visitors, online sleuths, retired officers, and parents who had lost children of their own. Each message she received was read carefully, though most offered nothing new. Detective Sergeant Dana Keller stayed with the case until 2008. By then, she had transferred to Calgary, but Brett's file followed her like a shadow. She occasionally reopened it, checking if new technology might help. DNA testing, digital trace analysis, tire pattern databases. Each year offered something new, but nothing matched. Before her retirement, Keller wrote one final memo. Case unresolved. No evidence of voluntary disappearance. No remains recovered. Foul play suspected but unproven. After that, the Morrison file was boxed, labeled, and placed in long-term storage at the RCMP records facility in Edmonton. The world moved forward without answers. By 2010, Drumheller's university campus had expanded. New lecture halls replaced the old dorms. Students came and went, few remembering the boy from Oregon. The grain elevator, once tall and functional, had become a crumbling relic. Its wooden frame warped by weather, graffiti sprayed across its base. Locals called it haunted. On certain nights, people claimed to see lights inside or to hear footsteps in the dust. The story of Brett Morrison had become folklore, a warning whispered during freshman orientation. In 2012, A small documentary crew from Vancouver contacted Carol for an interview. She sat beneath the same framed photo, her voice calm but steady. "It is not about closure," she said. "It is about truth. He deserves that much." The short film aired late at night on a regional channel. For a few weeks, search interest in Brett's name spiked online, then faded again. Keller watched the broadcast from her living room. She recognized the same pain in Carol's eyes that she had seen 16 years earlier in the station conference room. When the credits rolled, Keller turned off the television and sat in silence for a long time. Over the next few years, Carol's health began to waver. She still answered every email that mentioned Brett's name. She still believed someone in Drumheller knew what had happened. But time was cruel. Friends told her to move on. Reporters stopped calling. The RCMP rarely returned her messages. Meanwhile, the files remained untouched. Dust gathered along the edges of the case folders. The once vivid photographs had begun to yellow. Somewhere in the depths of the evidence locker, Brett's cast boot print and a blank evidence bag labeled "Memory Card Missing" still sat, filed under M. By 2016, the website's counter showed over 1 million visitors, though few left messages. Carol kept updating it, marking every October 17th with a new entry. Another year without answers. On the 16th anniversary, she wrote a post that felt different, quiet, almost resigned. "You would be 34 now," she typed. "I still see you as you were, walking into the night, wearing that old jacket. I hope wherever you are not cold." The next morning, the post had hundreds of shares. Old classmates, journalists, and strangers commented beneath it, reviving a case that had long gone silent. But for Carol, there was no comfort in attention. There was only the ache of years lost and the image of her son frozen in time. For 16 years, Brett Morrison remained 18. The envelope arrived on a cold January morning. Carol Morrison found it wedged between grocery store flyers and a power bill, the paper slightly damp from rain. Her first thought was that it was junk mail, until she saw the return stamp, Drumheller, Alberta. Her hands trembled as she turned it over. There was no return address. The handwriting on the front was uneven, written in dark blue ink. Inside was a single sheet of lined paper, folded twice. In the center, one line was written in the same shaky script. "I know where the American student is buried." There was no signature, no date, nothing else. For nearly 2 decades, Carol had received messages, online theories, fake leads, cruel hoaxes. But this one felt different. The tone was deliberate. Not taunting, not vague, just final. She called the RCMP that afternoon. Within 24 hours, the case of Brett Morrison was officially reopened. The file was reassigned to Detective Elena Dufresne, a digital forensics specialist based in Calgary. Dufresne was methodical, quiet, and relentless, the kind of investigator who found patterns in data others overlooked. When she received the scanned image of the note, she immediately noticed something small, the type of pen used. It was a Pilot G2 gel pen, still common, but manufactured in limited batches in Canada during the late 2000s. The writing pressure suggested age and hesitation, not someone trying to frighten, but someone who had wrestled with guilt. The RCMP traced the postmark to a mail sorting facility outside Drumheller. The envelope had been dropped in a blue collection box on December 28, 2018, just before New Year's Eve. Surveillance footage from that night showed a person in a parka with the hood raised, walking away quickly. The footage was grainy and indistinct, but the movement pattern suggested someone middle-aged. The letter reignited media attention. News outlets in Alberta ran headlines reading, "Anonymous letter could crack 2002 disappearance." For Carol, the renewed attention brought both hope and dread. She had been through this cycle before. A new headline, a surge of sympathy, and then silence. But Detective Dufresne assured her this time was different. Dufresne began with forensic linguistics. Every stroke of the pen, every loop and spacing was analyzed. Experts compared it to old campus records, alumni letters, and even anonymous comments on Brett's old memorial website. One preliminary match stood out, a series of anonymous online posts from 2006 that referenced "a night that went too far" in Drumheller. The syntax and word spacing were strikingly similar. When the language data was layered over the postal trace, one location kept appearing, the eastern edge of Drumheller, near the old industrial road that led to the abandoned grain elevator. Detective Dufresne and her team revisited the original scene. The elevator was nearly gone, its frame collapsed under decades of neglect. But beneath the rubble, cadaver dogs picked up faint traces, nothing conclusive, but enough to warrant further soil testing. Samples were sent to the RCMP lab in Edmonton. The press caught wind of the renewed search, and once again, Brett's name appeared across headlines. Carol watched from her home in Oregon as news anchors discussed her son's case with the same cautious language they had used 16 years earlier. Possible lead. Unverified tip. New evidence pending. Then, in late February 2019, something unexpected arrived at the RCMP headquarters in Calgary. A small padded envelope mailed from an address in Edmonton, addressed simply to Cold Case Division. Inside was a USB drive. No note, no label, no explanation. Technicians examined it carefully before opening the files. The drive contained a single folder titled 2002 Reeve. Inside were dozens of archived emails, correspondence between students from Brett's university program and one of their professors, Dr. Malcolm Reeve, dated between September and October 2002. Most of the emails were mundane, field assignments, project updates, class schedules, but buried among them were strange exchanges, mentions of a night out east, discussions about initiation, and subtle references to keeping things quiet. The timestamps matched the days, leading up to Brett's disappearance. When Dufresne saw the final message in the chain, she froze. It was sent from Professor Reeve's account to a student named Travis Bauer, the same name that had appeared in the old 2002 police files. The message read, "Handle it. The university cannot afford another scandal." That single sentence changed everything. Within hours, Dufresne ordered the university's old digital archives pulled for re-examination. The investigation that had gone cold for 16 years had just burst open, triggered by one short letter and a confession hidden in data. Somewhere in Alberta, the person who sent that envelope was watching the news, knowing that the truth was finally on its way to the surface. It began with a recovered email, a simple line buried deep within a corrupted archive file. The RCMP's digital forensics team had spent weeks combing through the contents of the anonymous USB drive, piecing together fragments of code, restoring deleted attachments, and cross-referencing timestamps. What emerged was not an accident, not a disappearance, but a cover-up. Detective Elena Dufresne watched as her monitor filled with reconstructed messages from the fall of 2002. Some were incomplete, some gibberish, but others were chillingly clear. The recovered thread centered around a private group of students: Travis Bauer, Liam Frost, Erin Calloway, and Nick Hart, all upperclassmen in the forestry program. Their emails were filled with casual confidence, jokes about tradition, and plans for something called Initiation Night. One message dated October 16, 2002 read, "Meet at the elevator. Bring the lights and ropes. Reeve says it has to look authentic this year." It was signed by Bauer. The next series of messages painted a darker picture. Mentions of the new kid from Oregon and making him earn it hinted that Brett Morrison had been chosen as the freshman target. Attached photo metadata confirmed the images had been taken that same night. Faint shots of the grain elevator's interior, beams of light cutting through dust, and what appeared to be several figures standing near the old chute system. The timestamps matched the hours. After Brett left his dorm, Dufresne leaned closer to the screen as her team restored another batch of deleted data. Hidden in the files was an email draft, never sent, from student Erin Calloway. It read only 4 words before abruptly cutting off. "Something went wrong tonight. Through forensic reconstruction, investigators determined the draft had been saved at 11:47 p.m., just over an hour after Brett was last seen walking toward the elevator. The Digital Forensics Division went deeper. They retrieved cached forum posts from an old university message board, one that had shut down years earlier. Using digital timestamps and Internet Archive data, they identified deleted threads from October 2002 discussing initiation. Gone Wrong, and Reeves' cover. The usernames matched those of Bauer's peers. Every recovered line of data led to the same conclusion. Brett Morrison had not vanished by choice. He had been the victim of a hazing ritual gone wrong. According to metadata embedded in a deleted JPEG file, the group had brought alcohol and climbing ropes to the site that night. The camera model, a Canon PowerShot A40, was traced back to a purchase made by Professor Malcolm Reeve, billed to the university's Natural Resources Department. It was the same camera model listed as missing in the 2003 evidence log. Dufresne stared at the recovered photo. The image was grainy, but the outline of a denim jacket was visible near the base of the elevator shaft. By early March 2019, Dufresne and her team had enough to reopen interviews with the original students. Some had moved across Canada, others had changed names, but all carried the same tension when contacted. They had built adult lives, careers, families, distance, but the mention of Brett Morrison's name still struck like a fracture line through time. Travis Bauer was the first to be called in. He was 38 now, heavier, and visibly exhausted when he walked into the RCMP field office. His hands shook as he placed them on the table. Dufresne started the recorder and began asking about initiation night. At first, Bauer insisted it was harmless. A walk, a few drinks, some pranks. But as Dufresne laid out the digital evidence, the emails, the timestamps, the camera purchase records, his voice began to crack. She showed him one final image, the recovered photograph with the faint outline of Brett's jacket. The silence that followed was unbearable. Then Bauer spoke softly, almost to himself. He was supposed to climb down the chute, he said. We tied a line for him, told him it was safe. He slipped. Dufresne let him continue. There was a scream, Bauer said, his hands gripping the edge of the table. We ran down, but he was not moving. There was blood. A lot of it. He looked up then, his eyes red and distant. Reeves said calling the police would destroy everything. Our futures, the university's name, his reputation. According to Bauer, Reeve had arrived at the scene within 30 minutes. He ordered the students to carry Brett's body outside, load it into the bed of a pickup truck, and drive to a nearby disused field. There, under the professor's direction, they buried him in a shallow grave near an irrigation trench. Reeve took Brett's jacket and backpack, claiming he would dispose of them. The camera and field notebook disappeared soon after. When the others protested, Reeve assured them he would handle the authorities. He told them Brett's disappearance would be classified as accidental. Within days, that is exactly what happened. Bauer broke down as he spoke. He wasn't supposed to die, he said, his voice trembling. It was just supposed to scare him. Reeve said we had to make it disappear. The words hung heavy in the room, a confession years too late. Dufresne stopped the recorder. Outside, the snow had begun to fall again, coating the streets of Drumheller in a pale silence. For 17 years, the truth had been buried beneath layers of fear, loyalty, and lies. Now, for the first time, the story of Brett Morrison was no longer hidden in shadows or silence. It was written in data, each recovered byte, each restored word, a digital resurrection of what the town had tried to forget. And somewhere in Alberta, one man, Professor Malcolm Reeve, was about to face the past he had spent half a lifetime covering up. The interview room was small, windowless, and silent except for the hum of the overhead light. Professor Malcolm Reeve sat at the table, his hands folded neatly, his glasses placed beside a cup of untouched water. He was 61 now, his once dark hair gone grey, his voice still measured, the voice of a man used to authority. Detective Elena Dufresne entered the room with a folder tucked beneath her arm. She placed it in front of him and took her seat. The RCMP had already briefed him. He was not under arrest, but he was being questioned in connection to the 2002 disappearance of Brett Morrison. Reeve adjusted his glasses, maintaining composure. I have already spoken to police years ago, he said. I had no involvement. The boy's death, if he is dead, was tragic, but not my responsibility. Dufresne did not respond immediately. Instead, she opened the folder and began sliding pieces of evidence across the table, printed screenshots of recovered emails, the anonymous USB drive, and the transcripts of student interviews. Each page carried a small sticker marked Digital Evidence, 2019 reopening. Reeves' eyes flicked over the documents. He showed no visible reaction, only the faint tightening of his jaw. Dufresne spoke evenly. These messages were deleted from your university account in October 2002. They were recovered using forensic reconstruction. You told your students to handle it. Would you like to explain that instruction? Reeve leaned back in his chair. Context matters, he said calmly. The students were organizing a field exercise. It had nothing to do with that poor boy. Dufresne flipped another page. You were aware of the initiation rituals, were you not? He hesitated. I was aware of rumors, unofficial gatherings, but I did not sanction anything. The detective's tone remained neutral. We have evidence showing you provided the camera used that night. We traced its serial number to a departmental purchase under your name. Reeves' hand twitched slightly as he reached for his glasses. That camera was for research documentation. Anyone could have borrowed it. For several minutes, the exchange continued. Denials, corrections, attempts at deflection. Then Dufresne placed a small portable recorder on the table. This was recovered 2 weeks ago, she said. It was inside a broken camcorder found during the secondary excavation near the grain elevator site. You should listen. She pressed play. The audio began with laughter, faint, nervous, echoing inside what sounded like a large, hollow space. Voices overlapped. A male voice said, "He has to climb it. That's the rule." Another voice followed, shaky. "It's too high." The beam's loose. Then a sound, metal shifting, a quick yell, and the dull final thud of something heavy striking the ground. The laughter stopped. Someone whispered, "Oh God." Another voice, calm but firm, spoke next, one that investigators later matched through comparison software to Reeve himself. Everyone listen. No police, do you understand me? We fix this tonight. The recording ended in silence. Reeve did not look up. His breathing changed, slower, heavier. Dufresne let the silence stretch before speaking. That is your voice, Professor. You were there. For several seconds he said nothing. Then quietly he nodded. Yes, he said. I was there. He kept his eyes on the table as he continued. It was supposed to be controlled. I told them to test their courage, not to endanger anyone. I was supervising from a distance, or that was the idea. He paused, his voice flattening. They called me when it happened. I drove out. Brett was on the floor of the elevator, his head at an angle that left no doubt. He was already gone. He swallowed hard, his composure faltering for the first time. They were panicking. One boy was screaming, another was vomiting. They were children, terrified, drunk, out of control. I made a decision. Dufresne did not interrupt. I told them to stay quiet, Reeve said, to bring him outside. I thought if we called it in, the university would be finished. Funding, accreditation, everything. I convinced myself it was mercy, that there was nothing the police could do for him. He took a long breath. We buried him that night near the irrigation trench. I told them it would be temporary, that we would come back and make it right once the dust settled. But we never did, he stared at his hands. The next morning I met with the dean. I told him the student had withdrawn, homesick. He signed off on the paperwork without question. That night, I burned the notebook, the photos, and the jacket. I kept the camera until it disappeared from my office years later. The detective's pen scratched softly against paper as she took notes. Reeve continued, his voice growing distant. For months I told myself it was an accident, that my silence was protection, not betrayal. But the lie grew heavier each year. He looked at the recorder. When I heard about the letter in the news, I knew it was one of them. Travis, maybe. He could never let it go. Dufresne closed the folder. You understand this statement constitutes admission of obstruction, evidence tampering, and concealment of a death. Reeve nodded. Yes, why now? She asked. He hesitated, then replied, because silence was killing me too. When the interview ended, Reeve was escorted out quietly. He did not resist, did not ask for a lawyer, did not look back. Outside, the winter sun had started to set, casting long shadows across the snow. The town that had once whispered his name in admiration would soon speak it with contempt. Later that evening, RCMP officers secured the field described in his statement. Ground-penetrating radar confirmed soil disturbances matching the burial depth Reeve had described. Within 48 hours, Forensic teams unearthed human remains and fragments of denim fabric consistent with Brett Morrison's clothing. DNA analysis confirmed what Carol Morrison had known all along. After 16 years, Brett had been found. The university released a brief statement expressing sorrow and cooperation. Former students issued apologies through their lawyers. The campus that once erased his name now held a permanent memorial at the forestry courtyard, a small plaque beneath a young pine tree. Carol attended the ceremony in silence. She placed her hand on the cold metal and whispered something no one could hear. Detective Dufresne watched from a distance. The investigation was over, but the cost lingered. A boy had died. A town had hidden it. An entire generation had chosen silence over truth. And as the plaque caught the last light of day, the narration closed with a single, haunting truth. For 16 years, silence was easier than truth. The morning of April 4, 2019, began like any other in Drumheller, until the RCMP vehicles arrived. Their sirens stayed silent as officers surrounded a small bungalow on Sandstone Drive. Inside, Professor Malcolm Reeve was eating breakfast when he opened the door to a line of uniformed officers. The man who had once lectured about ethics and environmental integrity was read his rights for obstruction of justice, evidence tampering, and conspiracy to conceal a death across town. Another team moved on Travis Bauer's apartment. Bauer, now 38, worked as a contractor, his student years long behind him. When police knocked, he hesitated only a moment before opening the door. His face was pale, his voice low. "I knew this day would come," he said. The officers cuffed him without resistance. By noon, both men were in custody. The RCMP held a press conference that afternoon at the Drumheller Detachment headquarters. The room was filled with reporters, cameras flashing in quick bursts of light. Behind the podium stood Detective Elena Dufresne, composed and steady. The blue RCMP emblem glowed under the studio lights as she addressed the nation. Following new forensic evidence and recovered digital communications, she announced, "We have arrested 2 individuals in connection with the 2002 disappearance of Brett Morrison, an American exchange student at Drumheller University. This case remained unresolved for 16 years. Today, we can confirm that Brett Morrison's death was the result of a hazing incident that was deliberately concealed." Her words echoed across every news outlet that evening. Headlines appeared within hours. Truth buried for 16 years. Professor, former student charged in death of Brett Morrison. University scandal resurfaces after digital breakthrough. For the people of Drumheller, disbelief turned quickly to shame. At the local diner, conversation stopped mid-sentence when Reeves' name was mentioned. Former students remembered his firm lectures, his reputation for fairness. No one wanted to believe he had ordered silence, but the evidence was undeniable. In the small community near the Red Deer River, residents struggled to reconcile the truth. Some had seen the flyers Carol Morrison once taped to shop windows. Others had dismissed the rumors as exaggerations. Now they realized they had been living beside a secret buried deeper than they had ever imagined. At the university, faculty gathered for an emergency meeting. Administrators read from carefully worded statements about transparency, accountability, and institutional reform. Still, the corridors felt heavy with guilt. Professors who had shared offices with Reeve avoided eye contact. Students whispered his name as though saying it too loudly might summon ghosts. The old grain elevator, now fenced and condemned, became a site of uneasy pilgrimage. People left flowers at the base of its cracked foundation. A few candles appeared at night, their flames flickering in the wind. The silence of that place, once a local landmark, had become unbearable. When Carol Morrison stepped before the cameras in Portland a day later, she did not cry. She read from a brief prepared statement, her voice steady and deliberate. "For 16 years, I lived with uncertainty. I wanted the truth, not vengeance. My son's life ended far from home, but he is no longer lost. I thank those who refused to forget him." She said nothing more. The reporters waited, hoping for emotion, for a headline-worthy moment of fury or forgiveness. But Carol simply folded the paper, turned away, and walked back inside. In Drumheller, the reaction was quieter, but deeper. Former students posted online confessions, small pieces of honesty that had been buried just like Brett's body. "We heard things," one wrote anonymously. "We joked about initiation night." "We said nothing," another posted. "Silence is a choice. We all chose it." Detective Dufresne reviewed the statements in the following weeks, her work far from over. Prosecutors assembled a case that relied on digital forensics, recovered communications, and Reeves' own recorded confession. Every timestamp, every metadata fragment, every deleted file reconstructed the truth that had once been erased. By November 2019, the courtroom was packed. The prosecution presented the sequence of events with clinical precision: the phone call to Brett's dorm, the initiation challenge, the fatal fall, and the deliberate burial under Reeves' direction. Witnesses testified through tears. The once loyal students who had obeyed their professor now described the night in grim detail. Travis Bauer's lawyer argued that fear had driven his actions. Fear of expulsion. Fear of Reeves' authority. Fear of being blamed. He admitted to helping move Brett's body, but insisted he had begged to call for help. The jury listened in silence. When the verdict came, the room was still. Reeves was found guilty of obstruction of justice, conspiracy to conceal a death, and evidence destruction. The judge called his actions a betrayal of trust and humanity. He was sentenced to 15 years in federal prison. Bauer, who had cooperated and provided testimony against Reeves, was convicted of manslaughter and sentenced to 8 years. The judge acknowledged his remorse, but said the choice to remain silent had cost another man his life. Neither spoke as the sentences were read. Reeves kept his eyes forward, expression blank. Bauer wept quietly, his shoulders trembling. Outside the courthouse, cameras lined the steps once again. Reporters spoke over one another, narrating the end of a case that had haunted a nation. Inside, Carol Morrison sat in the back row, her hands folded in her lap. She did not stand when the verdict was delivered. She only closed her eyes for a moment, as if finally exhaling after 16 years. That night, the town of Drumheller lay quiet. The wind moved through the streets, past shuttered shops and empty classrooms. The grain elevator loomed in the distance, its silhouette a reminder of everything that had been lost. Justice had arrived, but peace remained uncertain. And as the closing narration echoed through the final frames, the truth stood bare before the world. After 16 years of silence, the truth had spoken, and it had changed everything. The field lay quiet under a pale autumn sky. The snow had not yet fallen, but frost clung to the edges of the grass. It was here, east of Drumheller, beyond the last line of utility poles, that the RCMP markers had been placed months earlier. This was where Brett Morrison had been buried. Carol Morrison stood alone beside the small fenced area that now protected the site. There was no ceremony, no reporters, no cameras, only the steady wind and the sound of dry grass shifting under her boots. She looked down at the earth, still slightly uneven from excavation. The investigators had removed what remained, but the soil held its own kind of memory. Layers of time pressed into silence. Carol knelt, brushing her hand over the frozen ground. She did not speak. The RCMP had offered to accompany her, but she refused. After 16 years of noise, of statements, hearings, and headlines, she wanted quiet. The truth had been uncovered. The names had been written into court records. Yet closure, as she had learned, was never a single moment. It was an ache that dulled, not disappeared. In the weeks after the sentencing, the case of Brett Morrison faded from national attention. The university announced a review of its policies, suspended the forestry program, and erected a memorial plaque on campus. Administrators spoke of reform, but few mentioned accountability. For many in Drumheller, the truth had brought discomfort rather than peace. Former students avoided interviews. Faculty distanced themselves from Reeves' legacy. In lecture halls, his name was quietly removed from publications and research citations. Yet his shadow lingered, a reminder of what silence could protect. Detective Elena Dufresne submitted her final report that December. It concluded with a single line. The concealment of Brett Morrison's death was sustained not by a single lie, but by the collective failure to speak. Her words echoed in every file, every briefing, every page of the case history. They defined not only the crime, but the culture that had allowed it. Carol read those words once, printed in black ink, and folded the report away. She did not need to read more. She had lived it. Standing in that field, she remembered Brett's voice on the phone, calm, thoughtful, promising he would call again soon. She remembered the last message he sent about the cold Alberta nights and the project he was excited to start. She remembered how those small, ordinary moments had become sacred through loss. There were still questions that would never be answered. Who wrote the letter? Who mailed the USB drive? Who finally broke the silence? Carol no longer searched for those names. The truth, in its final shape, was enough. The land around her stretched wide and empty. The horizon glowed faintly gold where the sunlight touched the frost. Somewhere beneath that soil, the last fragments of her son's story had been found, not whole, but finally seen. She stood for a long time, then placed a small pine cone at the edge of the fence. It was from Oregon, from a tree Brett had planted as a child. The gesture was simple, almost invisible, but it was enough. When she turned to leave, the wind rose. Suddenly, a low continuous sound that moved through the open field. It bent the grass and carried across the prairie like a voice too old to name, and as the narration faded, the final image lingered. Still, quiet, inevitable. The prairie wind moved through the grass like a whisper, as if the land itself was finally exhaling what it had held for 16 years. The story of Brett Morrison does not end in a courtroom or a field outside Drumheller. It ends in the quiet persistence of those who refuse to stop asking questions, in the patience of one mother, in the determination of one detective, and in the single trembling decision of someone who, after 16 years, could no longer live with silence. The weight of truth is not always sudden. It builds slowly, gathering behind walls of fear and loyalty until one small act cracks it open. For the town of Drumheller, that crack came in the form of a letter, a single line written in uneven ink that changed everything. It carried no signature, no explanation, only a confession disguised as a clue. I know where the American student is buried. From that moment, the story moved from memory to evidence. Detective Elena Dufresne, with her skill in digital forensics, and her refusal to see the case as legend, became the bridge between past and present. Her work showed how the smallest fragments, a deleted email, a corrupted photo, a timestamp hidden in code, could reveal what 16 years of silence had buried. Through her investigation, technology became memory's ally. What once relied on rumor and testimony now leaned on data and digital footprints. Every recovered message, every restored file, built a clearer image of the night Brett disappeared. It proved that truth leaves traces, even when people try to erase it. For Carol Morrison, truth was never about punishment. It was about recognition. She had spent half her life being told to move on, to accept that her son might have run away, drowned, or simply vanished. But she refused. Her faith was not in institutions, but in time. In the belief that lies, no matter how carefully constructed, cannot endure forever. Her persistence was not loud or vengeful. It was steady, unyielding, and grounded in love. The vigils, the website, the yearly letters to the RCMP, they were all acts of quiet resistance against forgetting. When the truth finally surfaced, it did not bring comfort. It rarely does. It brought clarity, and with it, a collective reckoning. A community that had once whispered theories now faced facts. Students who had treated the story as a cautionary tale now saw the faces behind it. Professors who had looked away remembered what they had chosen not to see. In the end, Brett's story became more than a crime. It became a study of silence, of how institutions protect themselves, of how fear shapes loyalty, and of how truth, once uncovered, changes everything it touches. The people of Drumheller moved on, as towns do. The university resumed classes, new students filled the dorms, and the old grain elevator was finally demolished. Yet, in quiet moments, some still looked toward the fields east of town and thought about the boy from Portland, the one who came north to study forests and never returned. Detective Dufresne closed her final report with a single line that echoed what Carol Morrison had lived by. The truth waits for those who keep searching. It is a lesson both haunting and hopeful, because truth does not vanish with time. It lingers beneath every rumor, behind every silence, waiting for the right voice, the right question, the right moment to surface. And so, as the narration fades and the wind moves again through the empty prairies of Alberta, one thought remains. Steady, cold, undeniable. The truth does not disappear. It waits, sometimes 16 years, sometimes longer,